Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into a topic that's absolutely central to international business: transfer pricing. We're going to break down the 5 core methods from the OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which are basically the rulebook for how giant companies price sales within their own family. So let's just jump right in with the big question, the one that this is all about. Picture a huge multinational company, right? Its division in Germany makes a really important part, and then sells it to its division in the United States for the final assembly. So, what's the right price? If you set it too low, you're artificially pushing profits into the US. Too high, and the profits all get stuck in Germany. That's the puzzle transfer pricing has to solve. And to solve that puzzle, tax authorities all over the world use a single guiding star. It's called the arm's length principle. Now, the idea is actually pretty simple, but it's incredibly powerful. It just says that the price between two related companies has to be the same price they would have landed on if they were two totally separate companies, haggling in the open market. It's all about ensuring fairness and stopping companies from just shifting profits around to dodge taxes. Okay, but saying you need an arm's length price is one thing. How do you actually find it? Well, to help with that, the OECD provides a whole toolkit, and in it are 5 distinct methods, each one built for different kinds of business situations. Now, these 5 methods are basically split into 2 main camps. On one side, you've got the traditional transaction methods. You should think of these as the go-to, the most direct way to do this. They focus right in on the specific price or the gross profit of a deal. Then, on the other side, you have the transactional profit methods. These are pulled out for more complex, tangled-up situations, and they look at the bottom line net profit. And there's a really clear pecking order here. The traditional methods are always preferred, and we're about to see why. So let's start at the very top of that list with the most direct, most preferred tool in the entire kit, the CUP method. The comparable uncontrolled price method, we just call it CUP, is, beautifully simple. It asks a really basic question. Can we find a deal for the same or a very similar product happening out there between 2 totally independent companies? If the answer is yes, then the price from that deal becomes our benchmark. That's our arm's length price. It's truly the most direct comparison you can possibly make. And this is exactly why the OECD itself calls the CUP method the gold standard. I mean, when you can find a solid comparable transaction out in the wild, it is seen as the absolute best, most reliable proof that you've got the right price. That's why it sits right at the top of the hierarchy. But, let's be real. Finding a perfect, identical match on the open market, that can be really tough, especially if you're dealing with specialized products or unique services. So what do you do when that perfect CUP just isn't there? Well, that's when we move on to the other traditional methods in the toolkit. And this is where the resale price method comes into play, and it's absolutely perfect for distribution companies. Instead of looking at the price the distributor paid for the product, this method flips the whole thing on its head and starts at the very end of the line, the price that product is sold for, to a regular outside customer. Here's how it works. It's a simple 3-step. First, you take that final sale price to the outside world. Then, you subtract a reasonable gross margin, basically what an independent distributor would need to cover its own costs and make a decent profit. And what's left over? That's your arm's length price for the original internal sale. It's a really clever way of working backwards to figure out what's fair. Now, if the resale price method works backwards from the final sale, the cost-plus method does the exact opposite. It's the other side of the coin. It works forwards from the supplier's actual costs. This one is a great fit for routine manufacturing or for pricing services between group companies, where the value is really tied to the cost of doing the work. And the logic here is just as clean. You figure out all the costs the supplier had. Then you add an appropriate markup for profit, the same kind of profit an independent company would expect for doing the same job. And that total, that's your arm's length price. So these 3, CUP, resale price, and cost plus, they make up the traditional toolkit. And you always look at these first if you've got the data. But what about those really integrated, complex supply chains where different parts of the company all add some kind of unique value? In those situations, the traditional methods just don't cut it. And that's when we have to open up the other side of the toolkit, the transactional profit methods. The first one here is the transactional net margin method, or TNMM. So instead of comparing the price tag or the gross profit on a product, TNMM compares the net profit margin from the deal to what other independent companies earn. Think of it like this. Even if 2 companies sell slightly different things, their overall profitability for doing similar work might be very, very close. By looking at the bottom line, T&M gives you a lot more flexibility when a perfect product-for-product comparison is just impossible. And that brings us to our last tool, the transactional profit split method. Okay, this one is really reserved for the most complex, most intertwined cases, where both sides of the deal are contributing something so unique and valuable that you just can't test them separately. So, when would you actually use a profit split? Well, imagine a US tech company and its Irish subsidiary are co-developing a revolutionary new AI algorithm. The US parent has the core patents, but the Irish team provides the massive datasets and the testing labs. See, both of those contributions are unique, they're super valuable, and you need both for the final product. In a case like that, you'd calculate the total profit from the whole project and then split it between them based on how much value each one brought to the table. Okay, so we've got 5 methods in the toolkit. They range from the super direct to the really complex. And that brings up the big question, right? How on earth do you decide which one to use? And this is absolutely critical. It is not a free-for-all where you just pick your favorite. The OECD guidelines are crystal clear. You have to select the most appropriate method for the specific facts of your situation. There's actually a formal process that guides you to the right answer. This choice really boils down to 4 key things. You have to weigh the pros and cons of each method. You need to really understand the transaction itself, which means doing a functional analysis. That's just a fancy way of saying you figure out who does what, who owns the valuable stuff, and who's taking on the risks. And, maybe most importantly, you have to look at the data you can actually get your hands on for comparable companies. At the end of the day, this just shows that transfer pricing requires a ton of careful judgment. It's really less about a rigid, one-size-fits-all formula and much more about a deep investigation to find the method that gives you the most reliable answer for that specific, unique situation. But even with all that flexibility, you have to remember that clear hierarchy we talked about. The analysis always starts with the most direct methods. You start with CUP. If that's a no-go, you check the other traditional methods. And only if none of those work do you even consider turning to the transactional profit methods. And this quote from the OECD guidelines really just sums up the whole philosophy perfectly. The toolkit is so diverse and comprehensive because the world of global business is incredibly complex. A method that's perfect for a simple distributor is going to be completely useless for a highly integrated tech firm, and that is exactly why we have all these different options. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. In today's economy, which is so defined by these complex global value chains and by intangible things like software and data, are those traditional methods getting harder and harder to apply? Are we going to see tax authorities relying more on things like the profit split? How these classic tools adapt to the modern world is going to be one of the biggest stories in international tax for years to come.